Hello, I'm Sumit Bose, and this is the Net Hero podcast. We've got the branding, we've got the hat, we've got the t-shirt. You can get some of those. Get in touch with us if you'd like to know it. But what it's about, what is it about? You know what it's about. Net Zero for Business. This podcast is about how businesses can help us transition to being better as a planet. Better business, better planet. We want to hear your views from scientists, from business people, from academics, from politicians, from you, the general public. So if you're interested in how we can try and cut our emissions, tune in, subscribe, join us. Now, on to this week's episode. Heating. Oh, heating. We've covered it many a time on the podcast because, frankly, we're either hot or we're too cold. And it's one of the things that every government, and dare I say, industry has struggled with for the last 10 to 15 years. We've decarbonised a lot of transport, we've done a lot for our energy generation, we've done lighting, we're even looking at waste. But when it comes to heat, as we all know, it's very, very tricky. There are so many technologies out there. Some people believe we should carry on with gas but mix it with hydrogen. Some people think that we should go to batteries and use that to heat, so electrical power. Others talk about heat pumps, and there are two types, Airsource and ground source. But what the hell are they? What do they do? And will they be a key player in our net zero journey? That's what I'm going to discuss today with Alistair Murray, who is the CEO and founder of a company called Rendesco. Alistair, how are you?
I'm good. Great to meet you.
Very good. Yeah, this is the way we meet these days. I'll never see you in real life, mate. This is just kind of online, but there we go.
Fine. You can never tell how tall someone is if you haven't met them in person.
I'm not that tall.
I'm miniature.
I look very tall sitting here and very branded. For people who don't know, they've probably heard this thing called a heat pump. And people go, what is it? So can you explain in very simple terms, what is a heat pump? And what are these two types, the air and the ground source? So let's start with what a heat pump is so that people can understand.
Yeah, so a heat pump is exactly the same technology you have in your fridge and your freezer, where all you're doing is moving heat from one place to another. So you're pumping heat from one place to another. As part of that, moving it, you also compress it down. So you might take lots of 10-degree heat and boost it up to 40-degree heat, so you can use it for heating. Or the other way around, your freezer removes the heat from the freezer and it dumps it into your kitchen, and that's all a heat pump is.
And what does it use? Does it have like a compressor? Does it have kind of tubes that suck all this stuff? Because you look at the back of the fridge and it's just like a bunch of wires. Most fridges are now all sealed anyway. So I've never really understood what the hell is. There's a kind of coil thing generally on the end of my one, which is quite old. So how do they work?
So you have two heat exchangers on either side of the system. You've got the heat exchanger, which is used to transfer heat that way. So between that side, and then a heat exchanger on that side. And in the middle, it's just a refrigeration circuit, which basically that's the pump. So that creates a difference in heat on this side and difference on heat on this side, so that heat moves across. So for example, in your fridge or your freezer, it cools the entire box, which then dumps that heat onto the other side, and then that gets emitted out the back. So if you look down your fridge or freezer, there'll always be some kind of heat exchanger which gently releases the heat into the room.
But your room doesn't suddenly get warm, does it? Because
it does produce a bit of heat, but you wouldn't even notice it, because the actual heat loss from your freezer, once it's down to temperature, is tiny, absolutely tiny. Yeah.
So it's the same technology which has been around for more than 120 years.
150. Yeah.
150. There you go. That's the same thing in heat pumps, is it?
Exactly the same. Yeah.
So what's the difference between this air and ground?
So the underlying technology is exactly the same. It's just on the heat exchanger I mentioned on this side, it's, are you pulling heat from the air or are you pulling heat from the water? Water is a lot more efficient. So whether it comes from the ground or from water, wherever it comes from, it holds a lot more energy. So it's a lot more dense. And so you can pull so much more energy from it. Whereas with air, obviously you have to work a lot harder to extract energy from air because it's a lot less dense. The other difference is that obviously the air temperature varies so much throughout the year. When you need your heating the most is when the air temperature is at its lowest. So when you need the air the most is when it's coldest, which is when it's having to work at its hardest to pull it which is why we principally focus on ground and water source, but we do install many air source heat pumps as well.
So
They've all got use case.
basically, yeah, the technology has been around, as we say, for a long time, but the heat pump market, I think, is still fairly new. I mean, I probably first heard about a heat pump about, not even that long ago, maybe 5 years ago, 7 years ago. What's the state of play of these technologies? Let's go through a few basic things. I assume they're pretty robust if they're based on our fridge. And are they easy to deploy? Because this is one of the things that people talk about is if we're going to transition heat and go to a lower carbon form, the ease of this is very important because I don't want people coming to my house and ripping my walls down. Yeah. So let's talk about those two things, robustness and ease of putting these things in.
Yeah, so robustness. I mean, heat pumps are new in the UK. A lot of people are just starting to hear about them. My mum and dad, for the first time, know what I do for a job, even though I've been doing it for 15 years, which is nice. But in Europe and around the rest of the world, they're the main form of heating. You go to Scandinavia, you go to Germany, France, it's the main form of heating. So it is quite unique to the UK because obviously what we did is we extracted all of our oil and gas from the North Sea and dumped it in to depress the price of gas. So we just haven't formed that base market, but that's what we're doing at the moment, and that's what we're trying to grow pretty rapidly. So the technology is there. It's the same companies that do air conditioning that are doing heat pumps. So it's Daikin, Mitsubishi, all the big names that you know.
All the things we know, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And so it's robust technology. It's not new technology. And then in terms of the scalability of heat pumps, it's always really interesting when people talk about this, because if we went back 100 years and someone said we've got this thing called gas and it explodes and we're gonna put in pipe work to every single house around the country and it's gonna cost billions and we're gonna do all of that, you'd look at them like they were insane, and there would be people saying you're never gonna do that. And where we are at the moment is in exactly the same position. But what we don't have is a government, I would say, who really wants to take that challenge. They want to set a number at 2050 and say, which is far enough in the future, you never actually have to think of the detail, and say, we're going to decarbonize by then. We're going to be net zero by then. And you say, well, are you going to plan for that? Are you going to invest in it? Have you got a plan to do it? And they say, the market will sort it out. And they didn't do that with gas. They didn't do that. They paid.
But it was a very different time to defend governments. I mean, the infrastructure laying was a lot easier in those days. We didn't have drives and cars and things like that. So you dig up a garden and a bloke would shove a pipe in.
I don't know if it was. You didn't have the same JCBs. You didn't have the same tunneling technology. You didn't have as many customers, so it's hard to make the commercial stack up. It was easier in some ways, more difficult in other ways. But the principal thing is you had a government that came along and invested billions into creating a network, and that cost then disappeared. They privatized it at some point, but that was never part of the decision. People either had a gas boiler and that was all they saw. Whereas for us, we're having to put in all that infrastructure and upgrade the electrical capacity, because the government doesn't do that anymore. And we're then having to put the final unit in. So what we've done as a company and what we've really focused hard on is splitting out the infrastructure, so everything that's outside of the house, to the heat pump inside the house. And so we package up one part, and that's infrastructure spending. So that's really long-term debt. So it's like 60 years, and it's really, really cheap. And it sounds really boring. I am aware that I sound boring when I talk about this, because you're talking about debt and funding.
But it's vital. Without it, how the hell are you going to get the stuff done?
Exactly. It's really fundamental. And so we partnered with a company called Last Mile, who the UK's leading utility infrastructure company, and they've provided £150 million, and that is purely to fund low carbon heat networks. Okay, and that's over a really long time span. So what that does is basically make the external network disappear. The cost of that network disappears, and what you're left with inside is just the cost of the heat pump. And that's where we come to the next problem, which is at the moment, the government subsidizes gas. So if you look at electricity, most of the cost of electricity is levies of one sort or another. Whereas you look at gas, and it has none of that. So when you're comparing the cost of running a heat pump, it's harder to get the savings versus gas than it is against gas. So
So these are the things that people talk about. I mean, look, you've moved on to finance ahead of me.
Yeah,
But that's
sorry.
good. No,
Yeah.
I like it. It's good. I do. But I just want to get back to the practicalities bit. So you talked about the robustness. The second thing I said about is the disruption of putting it all in.
Yeah.
And there are two ways we can do it, obviously, which is what you're doing. We'll talk about it in a moment. You know, you're going to a new build, bit of land, people are building houses. I get it. It makes sense. But crowded Victorian terraces, flats in our cities,
Yeah.
someone coming along and, you know, this is where there's been a lot of reticence. Also, boilers are inside. Now, generally, from what I've seen with heat pumps, and I might be wrong, particularly the Airsource, they've got to go onto an outside wall to work. So in terms of the disruption, what would happen if I said to you tomorrow, right, I live in a flat in Dagenham and I'm on the 3rd floor, can you get me a heat pump?
So when it comes to air source, so I'm not the world's biggest fan of air source heat pumps. We do install a lot of them, but I don't think it's a large scale solution.
Right.
We've installed many of them on large sites, and if you've ever seen one, they blow out a lot of cold air, and they can make your garden completely unusable because you've got freezing cold air being blown out all the time. They're quite noisy.
Yeah, they're very noisy. That's what a lot of the press has been about.
Yeah, and they get noisier over time. So as the bearings start to go and the fans, they get noisier. They switch on like throughout the night, throughout the day, and so
it's the story of Disgusted at Tomba's Wells, where the eco neighbour has got one of those and they're going nuts.
Well, it is that.
It's a big thing,
also,
though, isn't it? I mean, you don't want to get sleep disturbed. We laugh about it, but these are the things that really matter to people's convenience.
And noise aggregates as well. So one heat pump on its own is not the end of the world, but 100 heat pumps in a confined area is a real problem. So
you don't think the air source thing is a real goer? Ground source is different?
Yeah, so ground source, I agree with the disruption. I don't think we're going to scale up heat pumps without sorting out this disruption point. I don't think it's realistic that we're going to dig up every footpath in the UK, but there's huge opportunities. What we're doing at our large site down in Wellbourne, that's 6,000 homes that have been developed, and we're using the water network there as the source of the energy. So when I talked about how a heat pump works, we're getting 10-degree water all through the year. So even when it's -5 outside, we're getting 10 degrees water all year round, which is really, really efficient. But it also means that we're not having to drill all the boreholes. We're not having to dig anything up. That's easier because it's a new build site.
Of course.
But if there's lots of sites where you can repurpose the gas grid, we've already got infrastructure going up to every single property in the UK, whether it's oil or gas. You've got all this infrastructure in. You've got water going to that property, gas going to that property. You've got waste coming. You've got all this pipe work in. And it is entirely possible to reuse that to supply heat pumps.
Now that is really interesting. I will talk about Wellbourne in a minute, but so are you saying in an average street in whichever city we're in, and I will talk about the countryside in a minute, but let's stick to where most of us live, in cities or towns. Do you see there's a possibility that using this existing pipes that are going into our houses and homes, you could be powered by ground source heating?
Yeah, I don't think it's just a possibility. I think it's an imperative, because I think it's the only way it's going to work. We can't dig up all of the streets, and you've got all this pipe work sitting there, which is going to be redundant because we have to move away from gas. We need to reuse it, and there's loads of R&D going on at the moment. We're doing lots of R&D about how best to reuse it. But it has to happen. It's the only way you ever roll out.
So what you're saying, you could use the water, for example, where I am in London, there's a lot of water in the clay. Everyone knows that, the water table. What you could use that and start
exactly
to pump
that.
it in. So you'd need big sort of hubs where this stuff is pulled up.
You would have to have big hubs. So there would be disruption, but it's not the same disruption as digging up roads and pipes, which is the big problem, because not only are you digging up pavements, you're also digging up the driveway into people's homes. And no one's ever going to convince me that that's scalable. It just isn't scalable. No.
Let's talk about the big that you're doing now. So you've been going since 2012 as a company, and I know you've run a few networks, but this is your biggest project, which is taking place in Hampshire, sort of not far from Portsmouth. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So, this is where I do get heat pumps, because a bit of land, someone says they're going to build a bunch of houses on it. How did you guys get involved? And what will it mean once it's built? How are you going about it? Because it can't be that every site is perfect for this sort of thing. But clearly this place is good for your ground source heat pumps?
Oh, I would say that every site is perfect. Every single new site, every single new site has a
Yeah.
water connection into it. Every single new site can have heat pumps and should have heat pumps. There's literally no reason not to. Commercial, technical, no reason. So Wellborn in particular, the owner of the site, a guy called Mark Thistlethwaite, he owns the site. He's developing the site as
Yeah.
his own personal
He's
project.
building 6,000 homes, I think. Is that right?
He
Something
is,
like that,
yeah.
So
And
this is
he's
a normal developer. People say this all the time. Developer building housing on some land, right?
yeah. Well, it is. Apart from he's going to own, he's going to live next to the site, and he's going to retain an interest
That
in
is
the
quite
site.
unusual.
Yeah, and so his whole focus, his sole focus, is
Yeah.
on creating a genuinely nice place to live, like a sustainable community. And so,
Right.
whereas a lot of developers, you start speaking to them about, oh, we want to put in a heat network with heat pumps, and you see them glaze over, and they think, no, we want to sell houses quickly. We want to get
them
these out, we
done.
want to churn out the
Absolutely.
houses. He took the time, sat down, and when we went to him, in fact, it was them that raised it. They said, can we use the reservoir? And whereas most people look at you like you're mad and say, we're not going to take that risk, he said, absolutely, I'm really on board. If that's the most efficient way of heating and cooling, we're going to do it. And having cooling in every single home, that's a huge benefit. It's a much nicer way to live.
So let's go through some of this. How far is the reservoir from where this site is? How are you going to get the water there? How much sort of pipe work and stuff? And then what are you doing? Are you building one central hub, or are you building sort of connections to every house?
I mean, I'd love to make it sound really, really complex, but it is literally, there's a reservoir about 600 meters away from the site, and we're literally just taking two pipes down to a central small building which has some pumps in it and a heat exchanger, and that just gets pumped around the site. And then every house that connects has its own heat pump in the house, and it just uses that as the heat source and as the cooling source.
Where will they be, these heat pumps? Will they be in the cupboard under the stairs like our
Yeah,
meters?
cupboard under the stairs or in the kitchen. They literally look like fridge freezers, these units.
How big are they?
About the same size as a fridge freezer.
So
And it's got
a tall one, or are they?
yeah, a tall one. So you have the
Right.
hot water cylinder in the bottom part, and then
Yeah.
the heat pump in the top part, and that's all you have.
Noise. How noisy are they?
You could stand next to them and not know they're running.
So like your fridge, that sort of level.
Yeah,
Of
I
a
would say
hum.
quieter than a fridge. Some of
Right.
them.
And
Yeah.
then the other thing is, am I going to get hot water? Because this is
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
thing. This is the thing that everyone says. And am I have enough pressure to run my shower
Yeah.
when, the missus is having a shower, the kids are screaming, and all of that's going on, and you've got to wash the dog.
Yeah. So you mentioned before in your intro that there's no clear idea of what the right solution is, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's this, and a lot of that is purposeful. So you've got the gas lobby, the oil lobby, and maybe I sound paranoid, but it is a clear thing that they're lobbying against heat pumps. Okay.
Right.
And one of the things that they keep spitting out is this idea that you don't get enough hot water.
Yeah.
And it's just absolute rubbish. The heat pumps nowadays will do 75 degrees, which is scaldingly hot.
Yeah, that's right.
So we've never had a site that has not had enough hot water ever.
And what
It's
about
just
the pressure? Because obviously, what we have now is water pressure comes in, the boiler heats it, and we know what we're getting. With these, is there enough pressure to give, a 2 or 3 story house, someone's having a shower upstairs, someone can have a shower downstairs or use the kitchen?
Yeah, the pressure is exactly the same because it's all unvented. So what you get from the mains is what you get at the outlets. As long as you're storing enough hot water, so it's not like a combi where you're producing it as it runs through. You do have to have a hot water cylinder, but it sits in the heat pump. But there's no pressure problem at all.
What is this all about? Is this kind of just proof of concept, or is it something aesthetic? It's kind of one of those nice things people who live here go, hey, we live in an eco village, and I'm not trying to diss it, but you could say this is a lovely middle class vanity project, right?
Well,
where do you sit on all this?
I see it as the most logical decision. It is cheaper, far cheaper than an air source heat pump. It's far cheaper to run than an air source heat pump. It saves far more carbon, so it's half the cost to run than an air source heat pump. Produces far less than half the CO2. It's cheaper for the developer. It's literally a no-brainer to do it.
And in terms of carbon, this is the other thing that we've always talked about. Obviously, there is some energy required. You've got to pump the thing and run the electricity, all that.
Yeah.
But in terms of Are there any emissions from these ground source heat pumps? And then what is the sort of carbon saving compared to having an average combi boiler?
So are there emissions? There's no direct emissions from the heat pump. It only uses electricity. Obviously, electricity production at the moment produces CO2, but
Yeah, sure.
generally speaking, over
As
time,
the grid gets greener, so that
exactly.
that won't be an issue.
And so that's fine. And then how does it compare to a combi boiler? So an average network that we install just using boreholes and ground source will save about 25 tons per home of CO2 over a 20-year period. I can't put that into a more meaningful way.
No, I understand, but
yeah,
it's quite significant, clearly.
it is quite significant.
Yeah.
At Wellborn specifically,
Yeah.
we'll be saving about 40 tons of CO2 per home. So it really is a significantly better system for the environment.
Now, I think what you're doing is great, and I do like it, and it totally makes sense with what you're talking about there. But the problem a lot of people have is there will be a cost to all of this, which we've talked about. And as you said, we're not in the days where it's being funded by the state.
Yeah.
So that cost will have to go on to the consumer who buys that property.
Yeah.
Couple of quick questions on that. One, is that going to be significant? Maybe not, I don't know. And two, we're kind of used to boilers lasting a good 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Some people let them run a bit longer. So there's a kind of, we kind of know 10 years or so. How long will that heat pump last for that person who moves into that house? And I assume over time, what they've paid probably gets negated. But that sort of thing is a big issue for people because they want the reliability, don't they?
They do, yeah. So reliability, I mean, heat pumps last longer than gas boilers.
Right.
Our oldest site is now 15 years and it's the same heat pumps in there ticking over. I mean, your fridge will probably last longer than your boiler that you have. And the thing with gas boilers as well is the efficiency decreases over time. So in year 10, it's maybe at 80% efficiency or 75. So yeah, longevity is definitely not a problem. It lasts for a long, long time.
And the cost?
So the upfront cost, as I said before, with Last Mile, we fund the network side. And so that gets paid back over 60 years. And it's almost negligible, as in when you spread a cost over 60 years at really low interest rates, you just don't even see that cost. The actual heat pump in the home, it is a bit more expensive.
Because the boilers are normally about £1,000, isn't it, roughly? Something like
a boiler's about £1,000, yeah. So an Airsource heat pump will cost you maybe £8,000 per house.
That's a lot. Yeah, ground source?
Yeah, ground source will be about 5,000 for Wellborn.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's quite a lot cheaper.
But I assume with this one, this is kind of in there as part of the purchase of the house anyway.
Yeah. But ultimately, it makes its way through to the homeowners by increased prices. But the thing that we focused on is saying, yes, it will increase the houses by about 4,000 relative to gas, but you get cooling and you get much cheaper running. So we'll talk about the running in a second. And you've got the CO2 savings. So it should
over the long term, I get it.
It should be worth that 4,000 premium.
A couple of quick bits that I just want to clarify because I'm trying to build a picture for the listeners and viewers in our heads. Once this is built, and I've seen underfloor heating, so you just get the heating mat. How will this work? Are there radiators, for example, or are there little vents? How does that hot water heat these houses?
So on the modern homes are really, really well insulated to the extent that cooling is much of a problem as heating. So most of the homes will probably have underfloor heating on the ground floor,
right,
to provide that background heat. One of the problems with underfloor heating is it really leads to overheating in new build homes. You have a cold
very
morning.
Insulated house with that underfloor.
Exactly,
it's like a hot box.
Exactly. So what we're having is cooling and heating via fan convectors upstairs, and then underfloor heating downstairs. So that will effectively achieve climate control. So you set each room at whatever temperature you want, and the system will work to maintain that temperature.
So there'll be little fans somewhere in the house. Okay, right.
Yeah.
In terms of that, and you've already answered, I think, the next question, which was, I've got those little tap things that control your radiator. So a room we don't use, you turn it down and you can have that control.
Yeah.
And now they're very smart thermostats, all of that stuff. All of that, I assume, is very integratable with what you're putting together.
It is. I mean, that's an old school technology you have with radiators. What we
I'm
have
pretty old
is,
school.
so am I, unfortunately, as you can see from the grey hair. But yeah, in what we do, it's the same basic technology, but it's automated. So you just set that thermostat and it measures the air temperature and it will maintain that room at that temperature. Whereas with the TRV, it's trying to maintain water temperature, so it's a lot less accurate.
Why don't we just have heat pumps forever? Let's have a t-shirt. I've got the Net Hero podcast. You should have heat pumps rule.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I'm obsessed with them.
Where do you see it going? I think what you're doing is brilliant, as I said earlier, and I think it really makes sense. But for us to get where we want to go with heat,
Yeah,
there are problems of different technologies, and you're right, there are lobbies, and government has a balancing act. Whatever you've got to say, whoever's in
yeah.
power will have a balancing act. I see them as part of the solution. Do you think that they could ever scale to the level we need to go? Or do you think that just really needs massive, massive shift in our thinking?
No, I think they do, and I think they absolutely have to. I think if you split the problem into three, so you've got the money, so the actual money of funding it, and we can take care of that. We, as I said before, we fund it over a long enough time, that takes care of that bit. You've got the technical side, so the actual disruption, and I think we're doing some really exciting R&D projects which will get rid of a lot of that disruption. And then on the commercial side, one of the main things you do there, so heat is a local problem. It has to be produced locally.
Correct.
But electricity, you've got huge surpluses. As we move to solar and wind, you're going to have periods with massive surplus where they pay you to take the electricity. And so one thing we're focusing is on having this completely joined up system where you have a thermal store in each house and you can take and store the heat during the time you're being paid to take heat. So you're not paying for your heating, you're being paid to take heat. And then we link up all of those homes on that network. And when some are demanding it, it will take the heat. And when they're not using it, it will store the heat. And what that enables us to do is to use that surplus from the grid and not use it when it's peak time. So that's absolutely crucial, because if you don't go with heat pumps, say we just don't sort our stuff out and we go with 100 different options.
Yeah.
When we have that surplus, what are we going to do with it? We have a really sunny day. It's just wasted electricity. Same with the wind. It's just wasted electricity. So heat pumps have to be the solution. It's the natural counterpart to our decarbonisation of electricity.
How do you find your argument go down with colleagues just across the energy sector, developers? You've said, someone said, I'm not interested. Where do you see it? Is there a kind of bias against heat pumps, do you think?
I wouldn't say there's a bias against heat pumps. There's
or just a lack of knowledge?
Yeah, everything you and I have discussed today is complex stuff. And it's not an easy solution. People like an easy solution.
Yeah,
They're
they
like,
do. Yeah.
Here's a widget, here's a product,
I know.
and this solves your problem. And what I'm saying to them is blah 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 funding, blah 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 interest rates, and it's just so boring. I hear myself talk sometimes, and I think, oh my God, you're losing them.
What do you say when you go to a party? What happens when you open your mouth?
I find myself with no one around me trying to talk about heat pumps is what happens.
Oh, Alistair's coming right night. I like it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, but I mean, in all seriousness, it is one of those things. I think, when I talk to people in the industry, electrification of heat seems to be the consensus. Although there are still some people who say there will be a role for gas. And I probably think there is still some role for gas. But the way we electrify heat, in a way, heat pumps are there, but there's new or adjunct technologies that are trying to get into that space by saying, just stick a battery, right? Stick a battery with a heat exchanger and that'll do it. So do you think, in a way, even though they're on the same side as you, the people who are electrifying heat, they kind of got their own solution rather than going for this one?
I think it's fine as long as the solution is electrification of heat, which is the main thing. Absolutely have competing technologies, because the commercials will take care of it. If it genuinely is cheaper to put in a battery with an electric boiler, then the market will take care of that. And we're not scared to compete with that. If that was the best solution, as much as I love heat pumps, I would switch to that. But I think heat pumps are the solution. And it's not that I got into heat pumps and then decided they were a solution. It's that I decided they were a solution and so got into heat pumps. And you say gas has a role, but the trouble with gas is it's binary. You can't have a few homes on gas because you end up with stranded networks, and you either have the whole gas network or none of it. So unfortunately, even if gas wants to be a role, it's hard for it to be a role.
I've enjoyed our chat. Thank you so much for coming on today.
I haven't bored you to death.
No, you haven't. You've actually got me thinking heat pumps are interesting.
Okay, that is what I want to do.
Yeah, exactly. For me particularly, that is brilliant. That's Alistair, who runs a company called Rendesco. If you've got a heat pump, if you've tried one, let us know. Get in touch on social media. Best of luck with your project there, Alistair. I think you're doing a great thing there, and I think there is a role to play, and I think people have just got to understand a bit more about what you're doing. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time. Take care.
No problems. Get in touch. Get in touch with the podcast anytime. If you've got something you want to share, if you've come up with some kooky plan you think will get us to net zero, nethero@futurenetzero.com is the email, or get in touch on social media. I'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Net Hero podcast with Sumit Bose from Future Net Zero. Visit our platform for all things net zero. And if you or your business is doing great things on the path to net zero and want to be featured on the podcast, email nethero@futurenetzero.com. Follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.